get out of our session tonight. The focus tonight is going to be on reading comprehension, and we're going to do a full reading comprehension passage and a set of questions, and talk a lot about reading comp. We'll get to that in just a second. Just before we dive in, if you are looking for other free GMAT prep options like this one, there's a couple more things that we offer through Manhattan Prep. One of my favorites is that you can try the first session of one of our GMAT classes for free. So our GMAT classes are 9 sessions long, and each class is 3 hours, and you can come to a class 1, a full 3-hour session as a trial student with no obligation to sign up, although we certainly would love it if you did. And you get 3 hours of great instruction. That first session focuses on the overview of how the GMAT is scored and what you need to know about timing, but then primarily dives into methodology on data sufficiency and sentence correction. Another option for you is to try out our GMAT Interact tool, which is an awesome series of interactive videos that cover our GMAT curriculum, and you can sample that on our website for free. You are already muted, Remy. Thank you for asking. The way that I'll ask you all to participate tonight, and I will be asking you to participate, is through the chat window, like many of you are already doing. So if I ask you a question where I would like for you to answer, it is in the chat window, unless I say otherwise. Thanks for asking. That's very thoughtful of you. All right, so let's talk about reading comprehension. So before really I get into the details of what we're covering with reading comp, I just want to talk a little bit about 2 big questions on why cover reading comp. So the first one is, many students come into the GMAT and they look at their scores and they think, wow, I really need to focus on quant. We get a lot of students who are really interested in primarily in boosting their quant score. And a lot of students underestimate the importance of studying for verbal. So I want to put in a plug for studying for verbal and why it matters. There's a couple of big things that I want to point out. The first is the maximum score that you can get on either section of the GMAT is a 51. A 51 in quant, 51 in verbal is the highest possible score. One thing that makes many students think I don't need to study verbal, I need to study quant, is the percentile scores that the GMAT gives you. On the GMAT, there's a weird thing that happens with percentiles, where if you get, let's say, like a 45 in quant and a 45 in verbal, it's going to tell you you're at the 99th percentile. And in quant, it's going to tell you something else. It's going to tell you you're at maybe like the 50th percentile. And so a lot of people see those scores on their practice tests and they say, ooh, 50th percentile versus 99th. I'm fine with verbal. I need to study quant. But here's the thing. These percentiles are very misleading. First of all, they don't do anything in terms of contributing to your score out of 800. The only thing that contributes to your score out of 800 is this number out of 45. The reason that the percentiles don't match, even though the numbers do, is because of the distribution of people taking the GMAT. In general, out of all the people who take the GMAT, folks tend to be stronger in quant. So achieving a strong quant score means you're outranking, let's say, 50% of people, whereas achieving a strong verbal score, you're outranking 99% of people. But in both of these, you still have 6 more points that you could gain before you max out at 51. So it's very, very common for folks to look at their verbal score, see a percentile that's in maybe the 80s or the 90s. It's almost always going to be higher than your quant percentile. That doesn't mean that you have more points to gain in quant. The only thing you want to compare are these 2 scores. And so the mistake that a lot of folks make when they're studying for the GMAT is they focus really heavily on quant for like the first 6 weeks, and then they get closer to their test day and they realize, oh, my verbal score is holding me down. And then they have a lot of hard work to put into verbal in a short amount of time. So I strongly encourage you to make sure that when you're thinking about quant versus verbal and how should you balance your study time, don't look at the percentiles, look at the numbers out of 51. Those are what affect your score. And make sure that you give verbal its due. If you have questions about that, put that in the chat, because it's a really important concept that a lot of people have questions about. So Avi said, I feel like verbal score improvement affects the overall score a lot more. Would you agree with that? So in terms of the overall score, the number out of 51, those contribute equally to your overall score. So getting a 45 in verbal versus quant is going to have the same impact on your overall score. One thing that is different about quant and verbal is that a person who is getting a 45 in quant or even a higher score is missing 40 to 60% of the questions in quant. All top scorers are still missing a lot of questions in quant. Whereas in verbal, as you get up to the higher scores, people who are getting a 45 or higher are missing maybe 3 or 4 questions in verbal. So an individual question or a few individual questions can make a bigger difference in raising your verbal score than in raising your quant score. But I wouldn't say that verbal contributes more to your overall score. They contribute exactly the same. The margin of error is indeed a lot lower for verbal, Avi. That's exactly right, which is why this is something that you don't want to put off studying until a couple of weeks before the test. The other reason that sometimes people don't study verbal and reading comp in particular is that they feel like they are where they are with reading comp, and they have this sense that there's nothing that they can do about it. And I'm here tonight to strongly encourage you to believe that that's not true. There are a lot of things that you can do to improve at reading comprehension, whether you're starting pretty strong and you just want that extra edge, or whether reading comprehension is an area of need for you. I'm going to try to really lay out the major things that people can do to improve in reading comprehension tonight. The two big categories where people can improve are in their the way that they read a passage on reading comp and their comprehension of that passage, and the process that they use for questions. And both of those things are practicable. Both of those things are areas that you can take action on to improve. All right, so I want to hear from you all a little bit. When you think about reading comp on the GMAT, I would love to know what are some things that you find challenging? Tell me in the chat window, just it can be very, very general question. What do you find challenging about reading comp on GMAT, if anything? Aditya, I'm not sure what you mean by primary topic. I would love it if you could elaborate a little more. Got it. Primary message. That makes sense. Okay, so I'm seeing a couple of common elements, and feel free to keep them coming in. A lot of what I'm seeing has to do with reading the passage itself in a short amount of time. So people are talking about being afraid of running out of time, staying focused, being efficient enough, making sure that you remember what you read by the time you walk into the passage. So that's where we'll start tonight. So first of all, let's talk about how long should you take on reading comprehension. So on the GMAT, you're going to get 3 to 4 reading comprehension passages. Some of them may be short, so they might be 1 long paragraph or 2 normal size paragraphs. Some of them may be long, so they may be 3 or 4 paragraphs long. Your general range for reading a passage on reading comp is about 2 to 3 minutes, and you kind of want to adjust that so that you're spending closer to 2 minutes on a passage that is shorter to read it and closer to 3 minutes on a passage that is longer. One question that people sometimes have is like, do I have to read the passage? Can I just go to the questions and start by looking at the questions? I strongly encourage you to take 2 to 3 minutes to read the passage. You're going to be much more effective at answering the questions if you do so. Once you've read the passage, you'll get maybe 2 or 3 questions associated with that passage. And for the questions, you want to average about 1 minute and 30 seconds per question. That average is coming from general questions, which should be a little faster, so shorter amount of time, and detail questions on which you want to spend a little bit longer. So this is an average. So you might spend a little bit more than 1 minute and 30 on an inference question, which is a detail question. You might spend maybe 1 minute on a general question, which is a main idea question, where hopefully you have that idea in your head already. What we're going to talk about tonight is strategies for reading the passage. So we'll talk about how to get a strong read in that time of 2 to 3 minutes. And then we'll talk about some different reading comprehension, RC question types, and some of the traps that you might encounter in those. And the biggest thing that I want you to get out of this is what's the best process that I should use for each of these RC question types. We're going to get started with a passage in just a second. I just want to strongly encourage you, folks are doing a great job of participating already. If something comes up as we're going through one of these that you have a question about, please don't hesitate to put it in the chat. I am happy to pause and discuss. This is your session. All right, so let's talk a little bit about passage reading. Before I give you the first passage that I want you to read, I want to just make sure that you're oriented well to what you should be thinking about when you read a passage. So I'm going to just clear this screen for a second. When you are reading a GMAT passage, you want to have a clear handle on what's important and what's not important. This is how I can read a GMAT passage in 2 to 3 minutes, because I am able to quickly recognize what's important, and for things that I know are important, I slow down, I reread if needed. If like it's a challenging passage for me and I didn't comprehend it for the first time, I back up and I make sure that I comprehend it. I might jot down some notes about that thing that is important. For what's not important, I definitely read it still. I definitely make sure my eyes are moving over that text, but I let go more quickly if I don't understand. So I do not reread those portions. Instead, if needed, I revisit them if I'm asked a question about them. So what would I put on each of those lists? On the list of things that are important, there's a couple that really are what you need to track on any reading comprehension passage. The biggest one is you want to pay attention to opinions that are stated throughout the passage, or what I think of as shifting points of view. So the 2 biggest things that I look out for in any reading comprehension passage, or really the 3 biggest things I will put here, are new names, so of specific people, of groups of people, of sort of like titles like engineers say, and then I look out for opinion words, so things like argues or believes, and I look out for transition words, words like however or thus. The reason for that is that I know what I need to understand when I walk away from a GMAT passage is what were the major opinions, who did they belong to, how do they shift throughout the passage, and what does the person who wrote this passage think. If I can walk out of the passage and I can loosely describe that, I am in good shape for the questions. What's not important are the details. So for instance, if I am reading a passage and I see the words "for example," that is not a major opinion. It is a piece of support for something else in the passage. So that's something that I'll read, I'll move my eyes over it, but more than making sure I understand it, instead I want to make sure I know what is it used for. So I kind of flag that in my head as, okay, here's an example. This whole paragraph was trying to prove that dogs are loyal. And then it said, for example, and it gave this one cute story about how this one dog was super loyal to its owner. I don't need to know all the details about that. I just know that's where that example was. So when it gets into elaboration on facts, on details, on things that are supporting major ideas, I don't get myself hung up on knowing all of that information because I know that it's not going anywhere. I know it can come back. When I walk out of a passage, what I want to have in my head is a map of the passage that looks something like this. Paragraph 1 had an opinion. Here's the opinion, blah, blah, blah. It also had an example. And I might just have like one word for the example. Paragraph 2 had an opposing opinion. It belonged to this person named JT. Here's what JT said, blah, blah, blah. And it also had some support. What I focus on is, would I be able to say in a sentence what the opinion is? And would I be able to point out in the passage where the examples are? So I need to know what the opinions are. I need to know where the support is for those opinions. So I'm going to give you a passage in just a second, and I really want to encourage you to try that approach. You can take notes or not take notes, whatever you think is going to be most effective for you. But I want you to try to be able to come out of this with what are the opinions and where are they? Where are the examples? Don't get hung up on the details. So here's the passage, and I'm going to give you 3 minutes to read it, and then we'll pause and talk about it. And the questions will come later after we discuss the passage. Okay, I just looked at my screen and I realized that the screen sharing was paused. Were you all able to see that passage, or did it just pop up on your screen? Oh, good. Okay. Whew. All right. So that is your 3 minutes. And I would love to hear a little bit from you. I'm going to ask you 2 questions. The first is to tell me one thing that you thought was important from this passage. Let's see if we can pick out some of the important parts. Bonus points if you can tell me why you thought it was important. Okay, see a couple of things that really stand out to me in your responses. The first is someone mentioned differences between old and new. Any type of contrast in the GMAT is definitely something that you really want to pay attention to. So we have in this first paragraph the modern multinational corporation. We have the 19th century British firms, and then we get this contrast between them and the 16th and 17th century, which have usually been considered irrelevant to this discussion. Another thing that was mentioned was that there are 2 opinions, which is really important. So when I am looking at, so if I've done a good job with the first paragraph, I've noticed the major contrast. They're saying, okay, here's this way that modern multinational corporations are set up with this hierarchy. This kind of came from 19th century, but it's different. Or, you know, somehow 16th and 17th century companies are irrelevant. But then I see this word in reality. This really stands out to me for 2 reasons. The first is it's an opinion marker. When someone says in reality, they're about to tell you what they think is really true. So this means, okay, here comes what the author thinks. And that is something that I definitely want to flag. The second reason is it's another contrast marker. So it helps me to know whatever they're about to say, it's going to be kind of the opposite of what they just said. That's really important because maybe I didn't totally understand everything that happened in the first paragraph, but I did grasp that they said 16th and 17th century companies are typically irrelevant to this discussion. And now they're saying in reality, however, so I can anticipate that this next part is going to be all about how they are relevant to this discussion. Latching onto those contrast words helps me understand the relationship between ideas and helps me get a big picture framework, even if I don't totally understand all of the details of this passage. Okay, so I'm going to share with you a passage map. Actually, I'm sorry, I said I had 2 questions for you, and here's the second question. Can you tell me what's not important? Where are some places in this passage that someone would be okay if they didn't fully, you know, understand everything about that? Okay, yeah, so the examples in the second paragraph. So there's a couple great places in the second paragraph where I would say you don't need to understand all of this. The first one is when they start giving you this big, long list. When I see in reality, however, and then all of these things, I'm going to be completely honest with you. I never read every item on a long list. I'm like, I take a glance at it and I'm like, okay, this is a long list of all this stuff they did, but what is the point of this list? And I'm focused on trying to figure out the point of this list, which is going to come in the next sentence where they say it seems to have necessitated these hierarchical management structures. See, if you can't even pronounce these words, but I'm still able to do well on this passage. And I see, okay, that's connecting back to the big idea from the first paragraph about how management is organized in corporations. So this part, I slow down, I say, okay, I see the transition word. I'm going to make sure I understand how this is related to the previous sentence. This part, I pick up speed. I don't need to know everything on that list. This part, I slow down again because we've got a connection to the big idea from the first paragraph. So I need to make sure I know exactly how this relates to the ideas from the first paragraph. But then I see another for example. So I make a mental note or a note on my paper. Here's an example. And then I pick up speed again. I don't need to know all of the details of this example. I just mark it. Okay, this is an example. It's Hudson's Bay Company. So really, I can walk out of this second paragraph having done a very strong read of this sentence and then thought a little bit or even looked back to see how did that relate to the previous paragraph. Everything else is eligible for me to skim. Okay. And that is how someone gets through these passages in 2 to 3 minutes. I do not get through these passages in 2 to 3 minutes by understanding everything that I read. In fact, part of the reason I picked this passage for you tonight is that this is a passage that feels hard to me because this is not my ball game. I do not have a formal background in business or economics. And so a lot of this language is unfamiliar to me. These concepts are unfamiliar to me. So I wanted to show you what does it look like to be able to read a passage and do well on the questions, even when the content of the passage is feeling challenging. So speed up through these examples, slow down when something is a big idea, make sure you understand how it fits into the broader context of the passage. So I'll show you an example of how I would take notes on this. If you take a look in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see what I call a passage map. Now, of course, on the GMAT, you are looking at a computer screen, so you can't actually circle anything on the passage. The things I circled are there to help you see what I saw as important and help you see where my passage map is coming from. I want you to just kind of take a look at this passage map and compare it to your understanding of the passage. And also compare it to any notes that you took. And the two things I want you to think about are, is there anything that I should have focused on differently when reading this passage? And is my note-taking system working for me? Is it too complex, too intense, too detailed? Or is it not enough? Like, am I not taking enough notes to remember what I read? So here's where my passage map came from. When I start off any passage, I always read the first sentence nice and slow because I haven't ever thought about the difference between modern multinational corporations and British firms from centuries ago. So I need a minute to orient myself here. And I'll reread this sentence a couple of times, most likely. And I'll jot down some notes on the first sentence almost always. When I am given dates on the GMAT, I do jot them down because a lot of questions will depend on your understanding of the timeline of a passage. They love to trick you based on dates. Notice that I'm using shorthand that would be like probably kind of difficult for all of you to read and perhaps even difficult for me to read back to myself while looking at the questions. The reason for that is that my notes are not there for me to look at and answer questions. My notes are there to do two things. One, to make sure that I stay focused while I read. That act of I'm going to have to pick up a pen or a marker and write this on my yellow pad means I need to pay attention. And two, it helps me sort out what's important versus not important. But this is really just me jotting down what's going on in my head. So I have a quick summary of the first sentence, and then I'm immediately thinking, how does the rest of this paragraph relate to the first sentence? That's why I circled commonly believed to have necessitated this change. So the first sentence is talking about a modern multinational corporation has this structure that originated from 19th century British firms. And the second sentence is basically telling me why those 19th century British firms had that. They had these inventions that were important factors. And then they contrast with the 16th and 17th century, say that was irrelevant. My second paragraph maps onto what I chatted with you all about already. I marked what I see, I put AO. To me, that means author's opinion. So I noted this in reality, however, basically the author saying the 16th and 17th century are not irrelevant. Notice it doesn't actually say that. That's me thinking about the passage and putting it down in language that helps me connect the first to the second paragraph. And then I do a quick jot down based on this middle sentence about how they are saying they used hierarchical management structures, and I note the example, and that's it. When I get into the third paragraph, it's a similar setup for my notes. I notice that they use the word differ. We've got a contrast, so I note that the third paragraph is about differences. Then they have a bunch of examples. All I did was write examples. And then I noted at the end, they say, despite these differences, however, and the author makes a claim that this merits further study. I can see an author's opinion question coming from this. This is where the author's telling us why they wrote this passage and what they want us to think about, so I do note that. All right, and one thing you'll notice is that my notes are kind of decreasing in detail as I move from the first paragraph to the third, and that's because my notes are a support structure for me. When I first start a passage, I need more support. I need to pause more frequently. I need to write more things down, especially when I'm dealing with an unfamiliar topic. As I get into the second and third paragraphs, I'm getting a better handle on what's important, what's not, what is this topic all about. I don't need to write as much down. You don't write things down just to write them down. You write them down to help you think. All right, I'm going to pause for a second, and I would love to just hear your reactions. How is this similar or different to what you did to take notes? And do you have any questions about it? Do you have any reservations about it? Alternative ways of doing this that work for you? Tell me what you think in the chat. Okay, so I see a couple of important comments and questions so far. So Guillermo mentioned notes don't work for me. It slows me down. I have a good memory. That's totally fine. I am not here to tell you that you have to take notes. I personally find taking notes helpful. And when students have trouble with reading comprehension, I often suggest that they experiment with taking notes and see if it helps them. But if you know that you're more effective without taking notes, you just want to make sure that your mental map looks something like this, that these are the things that you attend to in the passage. It doesn't matter whether you wrote them down or not. Can you totally skip the for example, in addition, furthermore? Honestly, yeah. I would say that you could. It's not best practice. Like, I think it would be ideal if you took the time to run your eyes over that. But if I'm being completely honest with you, I think I skipped it when I read this passage, especially if you find that timing is a concern for you, then that would probably be a great choice. Abby mentioned that your notes have a lot more coherent sentences. Yeah, so I would just think about, why are you doing that? Does it help you to understand the passage if you write it down in coherent sentences? Or is that more just a habit maybe that you picked up in college or other times that you studied where you knew you were going to need to look at your notes later? One way to save time is to use less coherent notes. And I would encourage you, if you feel like your notes are slowing you down at all, to try to shorten them up. One reason that shortening notes up is helpful is it accomplishes two things. First, it saves you a little time, just literally, right? Like, you don't have to write as much. But secondly, if you are shortening it up, that means you're thinking about it, right? Like I can't just directly copy a sentence from the passage and sort of mindlessly write it down if I'm shortening it up and kind of putting it in my own words. And that's the best thing that can happen for you when you read a reading comp passage, is that you're thinking about it and you can put it into your own language. And if that's what comes through in your notes, then that's going to be the most effective use of notes. Julianne said, you mentioned that you don't take notes for reference for questions. What do you do instead for the questions? I'm going to show you in just a second, Julianne, but the short answer is I use the passage. So the notes are building my mental map and preparing me to answer main idea questions once I've taken good notes, or taking good mental notes if you're not writing things down. But once I've done a strong read of the passage, whatever that looks like for me, I know where everything is. So now I can quickly go back and find the information that I want to when I go into the passage. The passage doesn't go away. It's right there next to the questions the whole time. So it's always, no matter how good my notes are, it's always going to be a better source than my notes. It's going to be more accurate. Okay, Mahadi, great question. As a non-native, I need more time to read the passage and questions. How do you improve? That's a good question. So in general, if you are working on improving your reading speed, especially as a non-native speaker, one of the best things that you can do is read widely in the areas that are tested on the GMAT. So the reading comprehension on the GMAT is going to come from the academic discipline. Oh, don't want to type this in yellow. The academic disciplines of business. So you'll see a lot of economics type of passages. You'll see some science passages. You'll see some humanities passages, and possibly, I think those are the big three, possibly some social science. So you could, for example, start reading The Economist, The Wall Street Journal. You could start reading like a science magazine or a science journal to get more comfortable with the academic language that you're going to see in these challenging business, or in these challenging GMAT passages. Aside from that, the biggest things are just to make sure that you have really effective processes, so that you have a strong process that you use for reading the passages that allows you to skip some parts. You have a strong process for the questions, which we're going to go over in a minute. And you may also consider, if reading comp in particular slows you down, you might want to pick maybe one question per passage that you skip, that you feel is going to take you a long time. Oh, somebody just posted a list of sources to read. Vincent said, are there certain keywords to look for in a passage for what is important, and what are they? Yeah, so the big things that I look for are these transition words. So any word that shows a contrast, like however or despite, or for example, those are what we call transition words, and they help me link ideas together. So typically what comes before them and after them is going to be kind of important in helping me understand the structure of the passage. Other words that I look for are words like belief, agrees, argues, words that reflect opinions. So you'll notice, like I circled here, commonly believed. I mentioned earlier that I look for the place where someone's name or who they are or what they are is introduced. So that's why I marked 19th century British firms, 16th century. That's because typically right after that, they're going to say what that person's position is or what role they play in this argument. And I look for contrast words. So transition words, opinion words, and then basically stakeholders in the argument are what I'm looking for as I read. Great questions, everybody. Keep them coming. But since a lot of you now have your minds on the questions themselves, I want to go ahead and get into that. Oh, I see another question. Will we get a recording of this passage later? Should I actively be taking notes? I would encourage you to actively take notes because it helps you learn. Or if you find that it helps you learn, it helps me learn, but maybe it doesn't help everyone. But there is going to be a recording on YouTube of this, so you can just search for the date and it will be available for you. It's not going to be like emailed to you, I don't think. You just have to search for it. All right, so let's get into the questions. When you're doing reading comp questions, in general, you are going to do a 4-step process. So that 4-step process is going to be: first, you're going to identify the question. Second, you're going to find the support. Third, you're going to make a prediction. And then fourth, you're going to work from wrong to right on the answers. So what you're going to notice as we go through the questions tonight is I'm going to do this thing that you'll probably find annoying at first, which is I'm going to show you just the beginning part of the question, but not the answer choices. The reason for that is that you can do to boost your reading comp score on the GMAT is to learn to do all 3 of these steps before you look at the answers. The biggest thing that draws people astray in the GMAT is that they start reading the answer choices too soon, and they see a lot of things that look good to them, and they're not sure how to approach them. So let's go through these steps for this first question, and I promise we will see the answer choices in a minute, but I'm trying to train you to do the right thing on the GMAT. So this question starts with the passage suggests. That means that this question is what we call an inference question. An inference question is often going to use the word infer or passage suggests. What this means is that you're going to have an answer choice that is very, very strongly supported by the passage. It basically has to be true, but it might not be said in exactly the same way. It might be kind of flipped around or said a little differently in the passage. What I want to do when I see that I have an inference is check to see, do they tell me where to look? Very often on the GMAT, they're going to give you a little prompt that can help you find the right part of the text. So it says, the passage suggests that modern multinationals differ from early chartered trading companies in that. I want you to think about or look at your notes. What paragraph would you look in to find that? Just tell me paragraph 1, 2, or 3. Okay, so I'm seeing 1s and 3s. I'm with you there. So I remember seeing modern multinationals in the first paragraph and early chartered trading companies. I also remember the third paragraph talking about differences. So I would kind of like mentally say, okay, I think that's either the first or third paragraph. I would take a quick look back at each of those. And what I would find is that the third paragraph is probably the right place to look. How do I know it's the right place to look? Well, the GMAT makes this really clear. They typically are going to give you a prompt that has language that is right there in the passage. And what I encourage students to do is search for that language and don't stop until you find it. You have not found the right place to support your answer until you have found a match for that text that is in the prompt. Once you find that, that is your gold. That is your anchor for answering this question. So I find it right here in the first line. It says they did, early trading companies, got that language, did differ strikingly, differ from modern multinationals. All that language is the same. Great. I know I'm in the right place. Now I'm going to do a nice reread of this to have it fresh in my head and predict what I think the answer could be. So I'm going to give you a moment right now, and I do genuinely, I don't skim, because this is the important part, right? This is the clutch moment for me where I need to understand this part well in order to answer the question correctly. So before I read the answer choices, I do a nice, thoughtful reread. Maybe I skimmed these details for the first time. So I'm going to give you a minute right now to reread this passage and tell me in the chat window what would be your prediction for this question. And tell me your prediction in the chat when you're ready. Okay, I'm seeing some great answers. So I basically see there's 3 sentences, so there's kind of 3 directions this answer could go. Could talk about the dependence on the national government. It could talk about the difference in the top managers and their holdings. It could talk about this idea of operating in a pre-industrial world. So that's what I'm going to keep my eyes open for when I look at the answers. And as I go through the answers, I'm going to cross off anything that doesn't deal with one of those 3 issues. And then for anything that does deal with one of those 3 issues, I'm going to refer back to the text to see if it's a strong match. So I'm going to give you the answers now, and I will give you a minute. Make your decision about which answer you think is correct, and then I'm going to sorry, you should see it. Sorry, everybody. I went off screen so that you could answer the question, but I didn't realize that you couldn't see the answers. You should be able to see the answers now, and I'm just going to hop off the video for a second, and then I'll ask you for the correct answer. Okay, when you have an answer, you can send it into the chat. What do you think? Nice. I'm seeing a ton of correct answers roll in. Good. So a lot of the time, if you do that upfront work of making the prediction, the correct answer is going to jump out at you as something that's a pretty clear match to what you were looking for, and that is what happens with E. So I want to take a moment to address a question that I think Mahadi brought up, which is, what if we don't get this little prompt at the beginning? That's a really great question. And I can show you an example of what it looks like when you don't get that prompt. I'm going to skip ahead a few slides. So here's one when it just says, what's the author's main point? You don't have anywhere in particular that you can look. Here's another one. It says, which of the following generalizations regarding management structures would the author agree with? It does give you a little bit of a prompt, but it's a prompt that's discussed throughout the entire passage. And so it's one where it would be difficult to find any one place to look back at. So for a question that's just like, what is the author's main idea? That is something that you're going to use basically your mental map of the passage to answer rather than looking back to any one place. For a question that is just open-ended, like which of the following would the author agree with, what I'm typically going to do is take a quick scan of the answer choices just to see what kind of language is popping up frequently here. But then this is gonna be a question that's gonna take me longer because I'm gonna have to go through these answers one at a time and sort of find ways to validate or invalidate them. I'm not going to be able to predict from the text first. So I've got two options in this situation. One is I might say that's a good candidate for a skip. If reading comp is challenging for you, if you are looking to save time, a question that says which of the following is true and gives you no guidance for where to look is probably going to take a while to do. Might be a great question to skip. Another thing that can help save a little bit of time is if you learn to look for red flags in an answer choice. So when I think about red flags, I think about very strong language. So I know you haven't had a chance to do this question yet, but I would love for you to just glance through these answer choices and tell me what are some words that you see that are very strong, that might be difficult to support. Good, yeah, I see most. I see cannot. Any other ones? Necessary is strong. Adopt is just kind of a verb. I don't know that I would say it's like a concerning word. So these are the words that when I'm reading, I kind of put a question mark over them. And they are the first thing that I want to check out about an answer choice. It doesn't make them wrong, but I'm just like, did it really say that they are the most efficient structures possible? Let me go back and look at that. Did it really say that they cannot be successfully implemented? Let me go back and look at that. The other thing that I do to make this faster is I make sure that I am using efficient search strategies. So if I'm going to have to go back to the text and look for one of these, I want to know where to look so that I'm able to find it kind of quickly. So I'm going to look for one of two things. I'm going to look for either a concrete word like 16th century trading companies or the Boston Harbor, something that's going to be like, it's going to be easy to find because it's a noun and it's one that I don't expect would change. So for instance, I won't look for a word like adopt because I could easily see the passage not having used the word adopt, having said used hierarchical management structures. And I'm hunting for the word adopt and they put in a different word that's a synonym for used. So I want to pick a word that probably doesn't have a synonym in the passage, like a word that I remember seeing or a word that was frequently used, or even better, a word that was rarely used, a word that I'm like, oh yeah, they talked about that, but they only talked about it in one place, and I'm going to search for it. Nouns, yeah, that would be a great way to describe it, but in particular, concrete nouns. Nouns that are kind of like attached to something that you can picture, something that will be easy for you to search for. So I might, for example, search for modern multinational firms. Like just glancing at that, I remember that they primarily talked about that in the first and third. I might look for foreign trade and expansion into foreign trade. I should be able to find that. I might look for modern communications and transportation. I might look for high volume of business transactions. I might look for modern context. Notice that I'm not going to just look for hierarchical management structures because those are in all of the answer choices and they're all over the passage. That's the whole point of the passage. So I want to look for what is different about each of these answer choices and where am I going to find it. So we can give this question a try. I will, let's see. Actually, this one might be tough for you to do without the full passage. So we might just have to take it from there. Okay, So I think actually instead of doing this particular question, I would like to close with some thoughts on what you can do to practice for reading comp. And if you would like to see more of this passage, the source for this passage was mba.com. It's available for free. It's one of the reading comprehension practice passages. So when you go to mba.com, they have question banks. It's not the practice tests, it's just like the question banks, and there are 15 reading comp questions, and there's 3 or 4 reading comp passages, and this is one of them. And it has all of the questions associated with this passage, as well as answers and detailed explanations. It would be a great follow-up for you to do after tonight's session, now that you've read the passage and you've done one of the questions together and gotten a preview of the second one, to take a look and do the rest of the questions. So what can you do if you need to improve in reading comp? First is to drill yourself. So you learned a couple of major techniques for improving in reading comp tonight. You learned about making a passage map or a mental passage map. If that is something that you feel you could improve in, one way to drill yourself is to practice making a passage map and then compare the map that you make to the one in the official guide, to the one that we have listed on our navigator if you have access to that tool, or to any other reference that you can find. You can also compare your passage map to the correct answer on main idea questions to see if it was an effective passage map. If it wasn't effective, you really want to take the time to think about what are you focusing on that you shouldn't be focusing on, and what do you need to do, what do you need to look for and think about in order to focus on the right details. You can also drill yourself on the process that we just talked about of identifying the question type and searching for support and making predictions before looking for answer choices. If you want to practice identifying question types, you can go through the official guide, look at the question stems, and try to say, okay, is this an inference question? Is this a question that's asking for something general like the main idea? What strategy would I use on that question? As I mentioned earlier, for everyone really, reading widely in the subjects that are challenging for you would be a big help for the GMAT. So if you are really intimidated by those science passages, read some of those science articles. If you're really intimidated by the economics and business passages, read the Wall Street Journal, read The Economist. And then finally, the biggest thing about reading comprehension is improvement requires a really strong review. So when you review a reading comprehension passage and the questions, especially the ones that you missed, you want to make sure that you know why you picked the answer you did, but you also want to know exactly what was wrong with the answer that you picked if you got it incorrect. You want to know what is the text support for the right answer, and you want to come up with what we call a takeaway, which is what is something general that I could do differently the next time I do a reading comp question in order to help me get it right. Okay, I see a couple questions or comments in the chat. Okay, so I see, let's see. On the GMAT ESR, it talks about identify inferred idea, identify stated idea. So identify inferred idea would be an inference question. Identify stated idea is what we call a detail question, which is where it asks you a question about something that is explicitly stated in the text. You follow the same process that we used for inference questions. The only difference is there's not going to be as much rewording of the answer choices. So it's kind of like once you find the text, it should be a clear match. Shardul asked about when this video will be available online. That's a great question, but I am not personally the person who posts them, so I will reach out to her. And you can also feel free to contact Student Services, which is gmat@manhattanprep.com, to see what information they have about that. Danielle asked, do you suggest to time yourself while studying initially, or suggest taking your time to get familiar with the GMAT format and then move on to time yourself later? Danielle, I would say that for verbal, people sometimes find it helpful to learn the process first for reading comp and critical reasoning especially, and then start timing themselves. But I want to be super clear. If you're not going to time yourself, it should be because you are committed to practicing the process really, really well. It should not be because you're taking copious notes that you wouldn't be able to take on the real GMAT, or you're spending forever hunting down answer choices. You want to make sure that you're learning to do the steps and then you start implementing them under time. So I would encourage you, if you are going to do untimed practice, to limit yourself to maybe 2 to 3 weeks of untimed practice, and then the remainder of your practice for reading comp should be timed. What I really think is best practice is to always time yourself, but then give yourself an opportunity to replay a passage untimed when you are finished with it, and kind of like do it the way that you would have liked to. Ellie asked, GMAT in a month, is there room for a substantial improvement in RC? I would say if you need to get better at detail and inference questions, that is something that might be doable in a month. Main idea and general questions tend to be a bit tougher because that means improving your whole reading comprehension of a passage, which is just tougher to do in a short amount of time. So look at the types of questions that you you're missing and make a decision based off of that. Guillermo, can I continue this lesson on next class? I am really just a guest presenter for the GMAT, so you probably won't see me again for a while. I'm also an LSAT teacher, and so most of my free prep hours are for the LSAT. So I can't make any promises about the next class. I apologize. Do I like the Kaplan question bank and the CATs? I don't know anything about the Kaplan question bank. I only personally use the Manhattan Prep materials. As far as the practice exams, yes, I do like our practice exams. I think that they are rigorous, so they might over-prepare students a bit for the GMAT, which is not a bad thing, but something to keep in mind. Vincent, questions on sentence structure, like sentence correction. That's great. A great question, but it's also a really big topic, and it's not part of the reading comp topic, so I'm afraid I probably don't have time to go into it right now, especially since we're already over time. I would encourage you to check out the Interact lesson on sentence correction for some good free resources on that, or try one of our free trial classes. The session 1 goes into sentence correction, so you could be a trial student in one of our online classes. The website was mba.com. And lastly, I believe, are they still here? Tanmoy asked about accept questions. Accept questions, I think, do fall into that category that I was talking about, where if you don't have a prompt, it can be really difficult to answer. Accept questions are just really time consuming. So they could be a type of question to kind of deprioritize and actually spend less time on, or possibly skip. Remember that on the GMAT, the hardest questions are often going to be time consuming, but not necessarily help improve your score. So I would say I wouldn't over invest in making sure that like you have a great strategy for those questions, because they're not very common and they're very time consuming. All right, folks, thank you all for your questions. If you'd like to chat more, my email address is abell@manhattanprep.com. Would love to hear from you, but I am going to go ahead and hop out. Oh, sorry, I see one more question from Ellie. Should we start reading answers from E to A? Correct answers are most often at the bottom. I would say no. You should read from A to E. But one thing that I often do is kind of do like a quick glance, like a quick skim of the answers to see if there's anything that really matches my prediction. And if there is, I might move a little more quickly through the other answer choices in order to speed up my efficiency. Because you don't want it to be like answer choice D is right there and it says exactly what I thought it would be, but I'm slowly reading through A, B, and C and I don't even see it. So a quick glance can be helpful in terms of efficiency. Are the difficulty of RC questions depend on how we do on SC or CR? Kind of, Avi. They're all mixed together. So in general, the last question you did is going to affect the difficulty of the next question that you get. So what that means from practical sense is you don't want to have any major weak spots in any of the 3 categories. If there's one category where you're missing easy questions, it is going to pull down the difficulty for the other categories. They are not treated separately. All right, thank you so much, everybody. It was a real pleasure working with you. You had a lot of great questions and awesome participation, and I hope to see you again in the future. Good luck with all of your GMAT studying.